sometimes the world stops moving. Not in the way time does, but in the way a heart can when it's been quiet too long. It was just before dawn, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones and whispers that even the sun might hesitate to rise. Caleb Wren opened the barn door with the same stiff hand he always used, the one that didn't ache quite as much as the other, and stepped into that breath of hay and frost, expecting nothing but silence. Maybe a fox, maybe a skitter of mice. No, but not this, not a woman, not four children curled up like small, breathing bundles of sorrow in his straw. She was crouched in the corner, clutching a baby so tightly it looked more like armor than a child. Her dress was torn, her feet bare, and there was this look in her eyes, a hollow kind of watchfulness, like she'd already counted every way a stranger could hurt her. The three older kids had huddled close around her, like a wall of small bodies standing between the world and whatever she couldn't fight off anymore. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't raise a brow or ask a single question. He just stood there, like a man at the edge of a cliff who wasn't sure if he was falling, or if the world was finally rising up to meet him. Now, Caleb Wren wasn't the type to let folks in. Not anymore. Not since the limp, not since the accident that took more than just the use of his leg. He'd made a quiet life out there on that patch of stubborn land, fixing fence lines, chopping wood, and talking only when the silence got too loud. But that morning something changed. Something simple, something small. He didn't tell them to leave. He turned, walked back through the snow without a word, and lit a fire in the house. That was it. And maybe that's the thing about real change. It doesn't always come with thunder or tears. Sometimes it walks in barefoot holding a baby, not asking for anything except not to be sent back into the cold. Back in the barn, the woman didn't believe it at first. She stayed where she was until the smallest boy, must have been 5, maybe 6, peeked through a slat in the wood and saw the smoke curling up from the cabin chimney. The boy whispered something, and the baby stirred. She shifted, hesitated. Then finally, slowly, she stood up. It wasn't grace, it was pain. And Caleb, he didn't watch from the window, like some saint waiting to be thanked. He was setting out the old tin kettle, spooning oats into a pot, dragging out the good blankets that hadn't seen the light of day since the war. It wasn't pity, it wasn't charity. It was something quieter than both. It was presence. When she stepped through his door, she didn't say anything, neither did he. The children clung to her, their eyes darting from the wooden table to the hearth like they were waiting to be punished for just being inside. But Caleb only nodded toward the bench. The woman sat. And that was how it began. Not with names or stories, not with apologies or plans. Just warmth, just a fire, just a space made bigger by the choice not to shut it. The baby whimpered. And the oldest girl, Sadie, he'd learn later, took her in her arms with a care that said this wasn't the first time she'd played mother when she was still just a child herself. The boy beside her flinched when Caleb dropped a pot. Flinched like a sound could mean danger. That was the part that got to him. Not the bruises, not the silence, the flinching. Something had taught these children that footsteps meant fear. And so Caleb moved slower. He didn't speak much. He didn't crowd them. He just kept the fire steady, set plates on the table. And when he noticed the woman watching the oats boil, he placed the spoon in her hand and stepped back. Little by little, that morning turned into something else. Not safety yet, not trust, but possibility. The kind that lives in the corner of a quiet room where fear doesn't quite reach. And listen, there's more to this story. a whole season of healing and hardship, of fixing broken things that don't always show on the outside. But it starts here, in a cabin that held too much quiet, in a barn that offered more mercy than most men. If you've ever wondered how a home is built, not with blueprints or nails, but with small kindnesses that don't need to be repaid, then stay with us. Because sometimes the best stories don't start with a bang, and they start with a choice to stay. And if that pulled at your heart even a little, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe to the channel. We've got more stories like this, real, raw, human, and you don't want to miss them. This isn't just a tale about survival. It's about the quiet, stubborn kind of love that shows up when no one else does. And it all started with a man who didn't say no. The first night in the cabin passed like the breath after a long sob, quiet, strained, but still a kind of release. Caleb didn't light a lantern. He let the fire speak for them instead. Shadows danced along the log walls while the woman, her name still unspoken, sat with her children close, like she was trying to hold them all in one piece. The boy, the one who looked about 9, stayed alert, eyes shifting with every creak of the floorboard. The girl with him flinched when the logs popped in the hearth. And the baby, well, the baby just slept. That soft, deep sleep only the exhausted ever earn. Caleb had set out tin bowls and spoons. Nothing fancy, just the stew he'd already made, already meant to eat alone. He poured it out with the kind of slow care you take when you know someone else is watching, measuring what kind of man you might be. He didn't say grace, didn't expect a thank you. But when the woman finally reached for a bowl, with hands that trembled ever so slightly, he saw it. Relief disguised as resignation. She took the spoon, dipped it in, fed the baby. First? Still, not a word passed between them until the children had eaten. And even then, when she finally looked up across the flickering firelight and said, "I'll work for shelter," it didn't sound like a bargain. It sounded like something she'd said before, probably too many times. Not begging, not proud either, just practiced. Like offering her labor was safer than offering her story. Caleb didn't nod. He just kept stirring his own bowl and set it back down when he was done. It was enough. No papers, no promises, just a fragile truce shared over firelight and stew. By morning, she was already sweeping the hearth before he came in from the barn. The children didn't say much, just followed her movements like shadows. The boy helped carry in wood without being asked. The girl folded the blanket she'd used. They didn't ask if they could stay, and Caleb didn't tell them they couldn't. That was how it worked in those early days, a rhythm that built itself from silence, chore by chore. Her name came later, not in town, not in front of others. Just one afternoon when Caleb handed her a sawed-off branch and pointed toward the chicken coop door, which hung crooked on one hinge. She took the branch, raised her brow, and said, "Martha Elkins." Just that. Like she was naming a thing that didn't belong to anyone anymore, not even herself. "Caleb Wren," he said back, and that was it. Now, some folks would say you need more than that to start trusting a stranger. But those folks don't know what it's like to be too tired to hide anymore, to be so worn out from running that even mistrust feels like a luxury you can't afford. Martha didn't ask questions about Caleb's limp. And Caleb didn't ask what put the bruises on her arms or why the kids winced when they heard footsteps. He let her patch the roof when it leaked, and she let him sharpen her kitchen knife without asking what he was preparing for. There was a kind of grace in that unspoken agreement, like they both understood the value of not prying when silence was still safer than truth. Toby, the oldest boy, watched Caleb with a steady, suspicious eye for days. Wouldn't speak unless spoken to, wouldn't eat unless his mama took the first bite. But when Caleb let him use the hammer to tack up a loose board by the barn, the boy's shoulders straightened just a little, not all the way, but enough. Sadie, the girl, was quieter still. She stuck close to her mama, trailing her like a second shadow, helping fold cloth and stir soup. Sometimes Caleb caught her watching him from the corner of her eye, like she was still deciding whether he was more man or monster. One day, she dropped a cup and flinched so hard she nearly cried. But Caleb didn't shout. He just bent down, picked up the pieces, and said, "We've got more." She didn't flinch the next time. Evenings became something like routine. Martha would stir the stew. Caleb would chop wood. The children would gather around the hearth. It wasn't cozy, not yet, but it wasn't hollow either. One night, as the snow began to fall heavy outside, Caleb set out a jar of honey. He didn't say why, just unscrewed the lid, set it beside the bread. Martha saw it first. Her eyes softened. Sadie blinked. And then Toby, cautious, quiet Toby, scooped just a bit with his finger, licked it, and smiled. It was the first smile Caleb had seen in that house in years. That was how they lived in those first weeks. Not like a family. Not like strangers either. More like two halves of a broken thing learning where they might fit, without cutting each other. And maybe that's what made it work. There were no questions, no expectations. Just people showing up for one another in quiet, tired ways. A fire that didn't go out, a bowl that never stayed empty, a roof patched without words. And over time, that silence, the one that had lived in the corners of every room, stopped feeling like fear. It started feeling like peace. You can tell when survival starts to shift into something steadier. Not because the fear disappears, but because people start looking each other in the eye again. That's what Caleb noticed first. Not the chores getting done, or the food being stretched thin across more mouths, but the way Martha didn't flinch quite so quick when he stepped into the room. The way Toby started putting a little muscle into the axe. The way Sadie sat a little closer to the fire now, watching it not like a threat, but like it was telling her something she was finally ready to hear. It didn't happen all at once. Survival never does. It grows slow like ivy up a post, almost invisible till one day, the whole beam's covered in green. That's how it was with them. Martha took to the mending first. She never asked what needed fixing, just picked up what was torn, patched what was thinning, and put it back where she found it. Quiet, methodical. She didn't move like someone trying to impress or earn her keep. She moved like someone who'd spent too long doing everything she could just to keep her kids whole, and now, finally, she could catch her breath long enough to sew in a straight line again. The mornings were colder now, but Caleb found her in the yard one dawn, with her sleeves rolled up, cracking ice off the water trough like it was nothing. Toby stood beside her, not looking at Caleb, not speaking either, but when the boy lifted the hatchet and split a knot of kindling clean through, Caleb saw something settle in the boy's shoulders. Confidence, maybe. Or just the simple weight of doing something useful. Benji had taken to curling up by the hearth, dragging his little blanket behind him like a trailing comet. He was the quietest of the bunch. Never asked for anything. Never made a sound unless the baby cried. And even then, he just went and sat beside her like that would help. And Sadie, that girl watched everything She moved like she was still trying to make sense of the place, still measuring the walls. But her eyes, those big brown eyes, stopped darting around like a cornered fawn. She stared straight into the flames now. She'd sit beside the hearth, her chin resting on her knees, and just breathe. Caleb noticed all of it. Not because he was nosy or sentimental, but because after so many years of silence, the smallest shift felt like thunder in his world. He didn't say much, still didn't know how. But he started reinforcing the barn, tightening the boards around the north wall, fixing the roof, not for himself, not for the animals, but because he knew winter would come, and those kids didn't need any more cold sneaking in through cracks. That old barn had always been just a shelter, a place to stack hay and park the mule. But now it had memory in it. The memory of that first morning, that first sight of a woman too tired to ask for help and kids too scared to cry. So he made it stronger. Inside the cabin, routine began to settle like dust on floorboards. Predictable, familiar, the good kind of quiet. Martha stirred the stew. Caleb chopped the wood. Toby fetched water from the creek. And Sadie started laying the table without being asked. It wasn't pretty, wasn't polished, but it was something. And somewhere between the mending and the stacking of firewood, the cabin started to feel different, like it was absorbing them, taking their weight, their weariness, their stubborn bits and broken parts, and holding them, not fixing, just holding. Caleb noticed the way the baby, Emma, started giggling. Real giggling, not just wind in her belly. She reached for his beard once, caught a handful in her tiny fingers, and pulled. He didn't flinch, just made a low sound in his throat that might have been the closest thing to a chuckle he'd made in years. Martha saw it. She didn't comment, but something in her shoulders loosened. One night, Caleb came in late from checking traps and found a second pair of boots drying by the fire. Not his, not the boys', Martha's. She'd cleaned them and patched the seams, left them there like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she wasn't just staying for the storm, but through it. That was the night he knew this wasn't just refuge anymore. It was becoming something else. No one said the word home. It was too early, too fragile. Saying it out loud might make it collapse, but the signs were there. A spoon set aside just the way she liked it. The baby's blanket folded into a perfect square. A small pile of whittled sticks near the hearth. Toby's doing, maybe. Or Caleb's, if he was honest. The shape of survival wasn't just food and shelter, it was presence. It was knowing that when you stepped outside to feed the mule, someone would still be inside when you came back. It was hearing the sound of Sadie humming, off-key but steady, while she set the table. It was the soft creak of Martha's footsteps before sunrise, the hiss of bread on the skillet, the weight of Benji's head on his sister's lap. And even in the quiet, even with no big declarations or promises, that shape kept forming. Not because they were brave, not because they planned it, but because when people share work and warmth and silence, a kind of belonging grows in the seams of it all. And that more than anything was the shape of survival. Sometimes it's not the grand gestures that hold a home together, but the tiny ones. A shirt folded just right. A jar of honey passed across the table. A cradle leg mended without asking. These were the things that filled the cabin now. Not noise, not speeches, just small mercies spoken through doing. Caleb had never been the sort to make declarations. He didn't have words for everything stirring inside him, but his hands knew what to do. That cradle, half busted, one leg shorter than the others, had been teetering for weeks. He hadn't mentioned it, neither had Martha. But one afternoon, while she was outside with the baby and Sadie, Caleb slipped a wedge of sanded wood under the broken leg, fastened it firm, and checked the cradle's rock. Smooth, quiet, whole. He didn't point it out. He just nodded at it once when she walked in. She didn't say thank you with her mouth, but the way her fingers brushed the repaired wood as she laid Emma down said enough. That's how things worked between them now. Martha had picked up the rhythm of the cabin like it had always been hers. Folding his shirts without a word, setting his cup on the table before he could reach for it, knowing somehow when to give space and when to sit near. It wasn't service, it wasn't obligation. It was something quieter, something more dignified. It was the kind of care that says, I see you, I'm here. Evenings had changed too. The silence still lived there, sure, but it was softer now, less hollow, less like grief echoing through wooden beams, and more like something being rebuilt, brick by invisible brick. The children laughed sometimes, just little moments. Benji giggling when Emma grabbed his nose. Sadie cracking a rare smile when Toby showed her how to catch a mouse in a tin can. Caleb heard it from the porch and let the sound wrap around him like smoke from a fire he hadn't meant to light, but didn't dare put out. One night, without a word, Caleb reached into the back of the pantry and pulled out a jar of honey. It was the last one from the previous winter. He'd been saving it for no particular reason. Maybe because it was sweet, and sweet things didn't make much sense in a life that had gone quiet. But that night he placed it on the table. Martha looked at it, then at him. Her eyebrows lifted just a touch, but she didn't speak. She just opened it, handed spoons to the kids, and watched them dive in with wide eyes and sticky fingers. No prayers, no occasion, just the kind of sweetness that said, you're allowed to have something good too. The next morning, Sadie handed him a pine cone she'd painted with ash and berries. It wasn't much, but she held it out with both hands like it was a treasure. Caleb took it, nodded once, and placed it on the shelf above the fire. Later, when no one was watching, he gave it a small place of honor beside a smooth stone he'd carried in his pocket since the day his brother died. That's how it was, little gifts passed in silence. Even the way they moved around each other changed. Martha didn't hover like she was afraid to take up space anymore. She walked straighter, spoke a little louder, and when the baby cried, she didn't shrink, didn't look for somewhere to hide. She just held Emma close and kept stirring the soup. Toby started asking questions, simple ones, like how to fix the hinge on the shed door, or what to do if the mule limped. But Caleb knew those weren't really questions about hinges or animals. They were tests. Can I ask you something and not get hit? Can I speak without being shamed? And Caleb, quietly, simply, answered everyone. There was one evening where the sky turned that deep orange you only see in late fall. Caleb sat on the porch, sharpening a blade. Martha came out with Emma on her hip, the others trailing behind. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him. After a while, Toby spoke. We could stay, right? His voice cracked a little, like it had been fighting its way out of his chest all day. Caleb didn't answer fast, didn't need to. He set the blade down slow, looked that boy straight in the eye and said, You already are. No speeches, no big moment, just truth. That night the cabin was quieter than usual. Not from fear, but from peace. The kind that sits in your bones, the kind that tells you you're not on borrowed time anymore. And when Caleb stood by the fire that night, spooning stew into bowls, He looked at the pine cone on the shelf, the mended cradle, the folded shirts, the muddy boots lined up just so, and realized no one had called it a family. But maybe they didn't need to. Because sometimes family doesn't come with titles or vows. Sometimes it comes with shared honey, painted pine cones, and the simple miracle of showing up. So if you're still watching, if you're sitting there wondering whether quiet can carry a story, whether small gestures can build something solid, I hope this answered it for you, because they didn't need fireworks. They just needed a table, a fire, and the quiet understanding that no one had to leave anymore. And if this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe in the power of silent gifts and steady hands, go ahead and give this video a like. Drop a comment below about a moment that changed your life in a quiet way. And don't forget to follow the channel. There's more to come. More stories that don't shout, but still echo. Because sometimes the softest things leave the deepest marks. You can live tucked away in your own corner of the world for years and not be seen, not really. Then one trip into town changes all that. It was supposed to be a short visit. Supplies, a few tools, some flour, maybe boots for one of the little ones whose toes were poking through the leather. But walking into that town with Martha beside him, it was like stepping into a room where everyone had already decided what story they wanted to believe. Caleb had been to town before. Folks didn't bother him much. They knew him as the man who walked with a limp and kept to himself, paid in coin, nodded once, moved on. Nobody asked questions. He didn't offer answers. But with Martha at his side, her eyes lowered, her steps careful, it was different. The shop doors didn't creak any louder. The wind didn't whistle any harsher. But the air shifted. People looked, not quick glances, not curious ones, measuring ones. Heads tilted, words paused in mouths. A few women whispered behind scarves. A rancher leaned against his wagon a little longer than he needed to. Caleb saw it all. Martha kept close, hands tight around the baby, her other children trailing behind like shadows. Sadie flinched when the bell over the door rang. Benji held his sister's hand like he expected someone to pull her away. And in Toby, he didn't look scared. He looked ready to run. But Caleb, he didn't run, and he didn't let them shrink. He walked steady through the streets, his limp pronounced but unmoving. He kept one hand near his hip, not on his weapon, not a threat, just a reminder that he was present, that he saw everything and would answer to it. At the mercantile, he nodded to the clerk and waited while Martha chose needles and thread. When the baker's wife looked them over and leaned in to whisper something behind her palm, Caleb didn't scowl. He just stood a little straighter, made eye contact long enough for her to turn back to her loaf of rye. But the real test came by the blacksmith's. That's where he was. Merrick, the kind of man who always leaned too close to a flame and thought he was the one making it burn. He stood near the hitching post, arms crossed, that smirk on his face like he already knew how this was going to go. Martha saw him and froze. Just a flicker of a pause, but it was enough. Caleb caught it. Merrick didn't step forward, didn't yell. He just started asking questions, loud enough for nearby ears to hear. "Ain't that Martha Elkins?" he asked no one in particular. "Heard she ran off, or was she run off?" His grin widened, teeth like broken promises. "You keeping her now, Wren, or just borrowing her for the winter?" It would have been easy to swing, to let fists talk, but Caleb didn't move like that. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He just took one step forward and stood between Martha and the man. Didn't blink, didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry, just present, like the ground itself had risen between the past and the woman trying to escape it. And something in that stillness, something about how Caleb didn't need to yell to make his point, made Merrick step back. Just a little, but enough. People watched. They always do when things get tense, but no one jumped in. No one needed to. Martha's hand, once clenched tight around the baby, loosened just a bit. Caleb didn't say anything until Merrick finally scoffed and turned his back, mumbling something about women forgetting their place. That's when Caleb spoke, voice low, steady. "She remembers just fine," he said. "And she's not yours to name." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They sunk in like fence posts into wet dirt. Honest. Final. The walk back to the wagon was quiet, but it wasn't heavy, not like before. Martha didn't look at him, not right away. But when she did, just a glance, nothing more, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not relief, not even gratitude. It was certainty. Not just that he would stand for her, but that he already had. Back at the cabin, the children didn't ask what happened in town, but they moved differently that evening, more at ease. Sadie hummed a little while helping Martha cook. Toby helped stack wood without being asses. Benji started drawing pictures in the dust again. Martha, for her part, made cornbread, not because it was needed, just because it was warm. She served Caleb a slice with honey, soft at the center, crisp at the edge. He nodded once, no words passed. But she saw the way he chewed slower than usual, the way his shoulders loosened just a bit. It wasn't over. These things never are. Gossip doesn't vanish just because a man stands firm. But sometimes the way you carry yourself speaks louder than any rumor. And that day, Caleb didn't just protect her. He told the town something too. This woman is not alone anymore, not just in body, but in belonging. That kind of truth changes things, quietly, permanently. If you've ever watched someone stand their ground, not with fists, but with stillness, if you've seen dignity win over shame in a single look, then maybe this story speaks to you. If it does, don't just scroll by. Like the video. Leave a comment about a time you stood up, or someone stood for you, and make sure you follow the channel. These stories deserve a place in the light, not buried behind silence. Because sometimes, just being there, unmoving, unshaken, is the loudest thing a person can do. It didn't happen under fireworks. There was no speech, no ring, no grand gesture. Just a quiet cabin, low firelight, and two people standing close without touching, trying to name something that had already begun to grow roots. That night after town, after Merrick's voice had followed them like smoke, Caleb said just 8 words. He doesn't get to take you, or them. And somehow, that was the moment everything shifted. The words weren't rehearsed. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who planned what he'd say. But the weight of it was real, thick in the air, sharp as flint. He didn't look at her when he said it, just tossed another log onto the fire and kept his voice steady. But Martha heard him, all of him. He wasn't talking about Merrick, not really. He was talking about every man who had ever tried to own her story, twist it, erase it. He was talking about all the years she'd bent herself small to fit someone else's shape. And about her children, Toby with his quiet watching, Sadie with her jump at shadows, Benji who clung too tight, and little Emma who still didn't know what safety meant. Caleb was saying what nobody had dared speak aloud, that they belonged and no one, not the law, not the church, not the past, was going to come take them. Martha didn't cry. She didn't fall into his arms or whisper some trembling thanks. She just stood there, still, so still. Then she nodded a single small nod, as if to say, I heard you, I believe you, and maybe, I believe in this too. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with everything they hadn't said, but had started to live. Caleb didn't need her to explain what Merrick had done or why she'd run. He already knew enough. And Martha didn't need Caleb to say more. The fire between them didn't ask for proof or promises, just presence, just choice. That night, the cabin didn't feel like it used to. It didn't echo with loneliness anymore. It didn't feel like a place borrowed or temporary. It felt claimed, not by paper or law, but by people who had survived too long to waste time pretending. The children noticed, even if they couldn't name it. Toby didn't sleep with his boots on that night. He placed them by the hearth. Sadie helped Martha brush her hair. Benji didn't ask if they were leaving soon. And in the middle of the night, Emma stirred in her cradle, gave a little sigh, and went back to sleep. That hadn't happened before. Morning came the way it always did. Slow light through the window, coffee on the stove, boots scraping across the porch. But it tasted different, felt warmer. Because something had been named, not in the way preachers or judges do it, but in a way that mattered more. Like putting a hand on a wound and saying, I see this, it's real, and I'm not turning away. They didn't call it love, not yet. Maybe they didn't have to, because love wasn't the point. Belonging was. Caleb fixed a loose hinge on the barn door that morning, not because it needed it desperately, but because that door kept her and the children warm that first night, and it deserved to be made whole. Martha cooked biscuits that didn't come from ration. She used real lard, the kind you only bring out when you think someone's going to stay. Later, while folding laundry on the porch, she paused, looked out across the field, and caught Caleb standing by the old split rail fence. He didn't know she was watching. He had one hand on the wood staring out over the land, and in that moment she realized he was already choosing her. In all the small ways, in the mended cradle, in the firewood, in the way he never asked for thanks, only made space. That's how these things happen, isn't it? Not with lightning, but with warmth, with repetition, with someone showing up again and again, even when it's cold, even when it's hard. And maybe that's what this chapter was really about, naming what's not said. Because there are some truths so big, so raw, that putting them into words almost feels like breaking them. But sometimes the attempt is enough. Sometimes all it takes is someone looking at your past, your scars, your silence, and saying, he doesn't get to take you or them. That's not a line from a romance novel. It's a line from a life. From a man who's carried grief like a shadow and finally opened the door enough to let in something more. And for Martha, it meant she wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't just hiding. She was choosing. And not out of desperation, but because she saw something solid in him, a stillness. A man who didn't flinch at her story, but stood inside it with her. No, it wasn't marriage, no ring, no vows. But when Caleb stepped through the door that night and set the kettle on to boil, before she even asked, that meant more. That was something real, something earned. So if this story's reaching you, if you know what it's like to speak without words, to show up when you can't say what you feel. Maybe this is your moment to stand still and say, I'm here. Maybe it's time to name what's been growing in the silence. If this spoke to you, take a second to like the video. Share your story in the comments. Tell us about a time someone stood beside you without needing a reason. And follow the channel, because stories like this, they're still being lived every day. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay and say what no one else ever did. There wasn't a single day where someone stood up and declared, "We're a family now." No milestone marked it. No ceremony lit the way. What happened instead were smaller things, the kind most folks overlook, like the sound of soft laughter at a table that had once echoed hollow, or the way a little girl picked up a needle with trembling fingers and smiled when she learned her first stitch, or the steady rhythm of a hammer passed from a grown man to a boy, one nail at a time. That's how it started. That's how it settled in. The shape of something unspoken but true. Back then, the cabin didn't look like much from the outside. Still weather-worn, still patched in places, leaning a little with age. But inside, the light had changed. Firelight didn't just warm the room anymore, it reached hearts. It curled into corners that once felt cold. And the people inside it, they were changing too. Not in big, flashy ways, but in the way you do when you're safe for the first time in a long time. Toby was the first to take to Caleb. Not with words, he was too careful for that, but through action. He followed him out to the shed one morning without being asked, stood beside him in the snow with a hammer, too big for his hands, and helped patch the sagging roof. There was no talking, just work, just a rhythm. But when they stepped back and looked at what they'd done, there was a shared nod, like we did this together. That nod carried more weight than most folks' promises. Inside, Martha and Sadie sat by the hearth, bits of worn fabric in their laps. Sadie's fingers were clumsy at first, but Martha's hands were patient. She never scolded when the stitches pulled crooked, never sighed when the thread tangled. She just kept sewing beside her. Sadie would glance up every few minutes, as if checking to make sure her mother was still there, still with her. And every time, Martha was. Benji was the one who made the change visible. He was the shadow trailing behind everyone, mimicking whatever task was at hand. If Toby carried kindling, Benji found a twig. If Caleb stirred the stew, Benji asked for a spoon. It wasn't about helping. It was about belonging. About seeing his place mirrored in the actions of the people around him. And they let him. No one told him he was too small. No one sent him off. He was there, part of it, all the way through. And Emma, little Emma, was the heartbeat of it all. She gurgled near the fire, warm and fed, her tiny fingers grasping for everything and nothing all at once. Her laugh was rare, but when it came, it filled the room like birdsong after winter. Caleb once caught himself smiling when he heard it, and realized it had been years since he'd smiled like that, without armor. Martha had started singing again. Not full songs, not at first. Just little hums while cooking, soft melodies that drifted through the kitchen like old memories. It didn't matter if the tune was perfect. What mattered was that she was singing at all. It was the kind of sound that makes a man stop and listen from the other room, not because of the notes, but because of the hope in them. Evenings were the truest part of it. After supper, after chores, after the day had softened its edges, they'd all gather in the same room, not because they had to, because they wanted to. Caleb would sit in his chair, polishing tools or carving something small. Martha would be near the hearth, rocking Emma or darning socks. The kids would sprawl on the floor, telling half finished stories or giggling about things only children understand. There was no agenda, no performance, just being together. And it wasn't perfect. Of course it wasn't. Sometimes Martha still startled when the wind slammed the shutters. Sometimes Caleb found himself pulling back, unsure what was his to feel. Toby had nights where he stood outside too long, staring at the woods. Sadie still hesitated when someone raised their voice too quick. But even with all that, something held. Something lasted. That's the thing folks miss about belonging. It doesn't come all at once. It sneaks in through repetition, through trust earned in the little moments, through silence that isn't empty, but shared. And if you asked any of them to name it, they probably wouldn't. They didn't call themselves a family. They didn't hang that label on the wall like a signpost. But if you watched long enough, you'd see it. In the way Martha tucked an extra biscuit on Caleb's plate without saying a word. In the way Caleb shifted his chair when Sadie crawled under the table to play. In the way Toby looked to him, not like a guest, but like someone steady. Like someone there. Firelight glows different when it's surrounded by people who found something to hold on to. And in that cabin, it glowed like it had found its reason. So if you're watching this, maybe you've known that kind of quiet belonging. Or maybe you're still waiting for it. Either way, there's something powerful in knowing it doesn't have to come with fanfare. It can grow in silence, in kindness, in a roof patched by a boy and a man who never said the word bond, but built one anyway. And if this story stirred something in you, if you believe in firelight and second chances, and the kind of family that grows from shared pain and shared hope, go ahead and like the video. Leave a comment about your own small moments of belonging. And don't forget to follow the channel for more stories just like this one. Because the truth is, these aren't just stories, they're reflections. And maybe, just maybe, they're reminders of what we still have time to build. Winter came like a hush over everything. No announcement, no fanfare. Just the quiet layering of snow on the roof, the steady thickening of ice at the window panes, and the long breath of stillness that settled over the land. Out there, in the wider world, winter meant struggle, meant keeping warm, staying fed, trying to outlast what the earth had folded in cold. But here, in this small cabin tucked between bare trees and brittle fields, it meant something else. It meant rhythm. It meant presence. It meant that the silence, once sharp as grief, had softened into something that almost resembled peace. Inside, life didn't stop. It simply slowed, found its own kind of tempo. Mornings came with the crackle of the fire Caleb rose early to tend. No one asked him to, he just did it. It was the same way he always had. But now there were more feet stirring behind him, more bodies under quilts, more breath in the air, and that changed things. The space that used to feel too big for one man now felt just right for many. Benji, small and curious, had taken to following Caleb like a shadow on little legs. He asked 100 questions without speaking a word, just with his eyes, the way he tilted his head, the way he pointed to the nails and then to the hammer. Caleb didn't mind. He'd never been much for talking anyway. So he showed him instead. One hand guiding the boy's smaller one, steadying it over the handle, showing him how to line the nail just right before giving it that first strike. And when Benji finally did it straight, once then twice, He beamed like he'd built the whole house himself. Caleb just nodded and kept on. But deep down, it stirred something. Something proud, something warm. Martha, meanwhile, had carved out her own rhythm in the kitchen. There was a softness to the way she moved now, less of the tight, defensive tension she used to carry in her shoulders. She hummed sometimes, barely more than a breath, but it filled the cabin like the smell of bread baking. She stirred stew over the fire with one arm while balancing baby Emma on her hip with the other. And it all looked so effortless, you'd think she'd been doing it her whole life. But Caleb knew better. That ease had been hard won, earned, not given. Emma had started crawling, not well, not fast, but determined. She made laps around the hearth like a little explorer, hands thudding against the wooden floor, squealing now and then when she made it from one side of the rug to the other. Sometimes Clay would pause from his work just to watch her. Not because she needed him, but because that kind of innocence had become rare in his world. To see a child not flinching, not shrinking, but reaching, it did something to a man who thought he'd forgotten how to hope. Evenings were where the rhythm settled deepest. The light outside faded early, but inside, the fire burned long. No one talked much, but no one needed to. The children would play with scraps of fabric or wooden blocks Caleb had carved. Benji liked to stack things. Sadie, quiet but precise, learned to braid thread with a kind of focus that mirrored her mother. Toby had taken to drawing on bits of bark with a charred stick, scenes of the barn, the snow, the cabin itself. And always, Martha was there, sometimes sewing, sometimes sitting, always present. That's what winter gave them, presence. Not the kind forced by circumstance, but the kind you choose. The kind that comes when you've been through fire and come out the other side still standing. Fear hadn't disappeared, not completely, but it no longer filled the room. It lived in corners now, in shadows that didn't reach the center of things. And when it rose, someone was always there to face it. Caleb had never expected to feel this settled again, not after what he'd lost, not after years of silence where his own voice sounded like a stranger's. But as he watched this patchwork family curl into the cold season like animals learning to share warmth, he understood something. Survival wasn't just about grit. It was about presence, about choosing to stay, to care, to keep showing up, even when nothing was guaranteed. And somehow, that's exactly what they'd all done. Without fanfare, without vows, without even naming it, they'd just stayed. So if you're watching this now, maybe you know what that kind of winter feels like. The kind that forces you to slow down, to notice, to rebuild quietly. Maybe you've known the ache of silence, and maybe, like Caleb and Martha, you've also learned how to fill it. Not with noise, but with warmth, with ritual, with the small daily acts that knit people together. One nail, one bowl of stews, one gurgle of baby laughter at a time. If this story has moved you even a little, go ahead and like the video. Drop a comment, share a time when winter didn't just freeze the world, but softened something in your heart. And follow the channel for more stories like this one. Stories about it found family, about quiet resilience, about what it means to turn a cabin into a home, not with wealth or words, but with the steady rhythm of showing up, even when the snow falls thick and the nights run long. Because sometimes all it takes is staying, and a fire that doesn't go out. There are moments in life when the past doesn't knock, It barges in, loud, entitled, convinced it still holds power. That morning it came in the form of Merrick. He rode in like a shadow stretching too far across the snow, louder than before, more demanding. This wasn't the first time his presence had haunted the edges of their peace. But this time was different. This time he wasn't met by silence or fear. He was met by Martha and Caleb. They stood together at the cabin door, not huddled behind it, not hidden, but side by side. Caleb didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence was a wall all on its own, one built not of words, but of worn hands, steadied breath, and the quiet strength that comes from having something to protect. Not because he owned her, not because she asked, but because this life, this home, they'd built it together, and it was worth defending. Martha didn't flinch. Her feet were bare against the wooden floor, her skirt wrinkled from tending to breakfast. But she stood tall, taller than Merrick remembered. He tried the old tone, the commanding voice, the half-threats, the false charm. He said her name like it was still his to say. But it wasn't, not anymore. And the woman who once would have stepped back, lowered her eyes, wrapped her arms around the children and whispered, "Please," now simply looked him in the face and said, "No." There was no shouting, no gun raised, no need. It wasn't a battle. It was a claiming. Caleb didn't touch her, didn't have to. His stance said everything. She is not alone, not anymore. The kind of man who survives alone for years knows when to speak and when to let silence carry weight. And this silence, this moment, crushed whatever fantasy Merrick had about marching her back into fear. Benji peeked around the corner of the cabin, little fists balled tight. Sadie stood behind the woodpile, shoulders hunched, but watching. Toby had already moved the younger ones to the back room just in case. But when Martha stepped forward instead of back, everything shifted. She wasn't someone to be taken anymore. She was someone who had stayed. And there's power in that. Merrick sputtered, blustered, said something about the law, about ownership, about what was right. But the land didn't answer. The wind didn't move, and neither did they. Eventually he turned his horse and left, not defeated in some dramatic way, but dismissed. That's the thing about power. When you realize you never had it, it slips away fast. He hadn't come for a fight. He came expecting fear, and when he found none, he became small. After the sound of hooves faded, Martha leaned into the doorframe, not because she was weak, but because she was steady. Caleb glanced at her. She gave the smallest nod, like they'd done something sacred together, like she knew she could finally exhale. Inside, the cabin was still warm. The fire hadn't gone out. The stew on the stove still bubbled. Baby Emma had stirred but not cried. The house hadn't been touched, and neither had they. Later that evening, Caleb took to mending the door frame where Merrick's boot had thudded too hard. Toby offered him nails without being asked. Sadie brushed dust off the windowsill. Martha added more herbs to the pot like it was just any other day. And maybe it was, because life didn't pause for shadows. It just kept moving, and this time it moved with them, not around them. There was no big conversation, no debrief. That wasn't their way. But the way Martha set the table that night, carefully, evenly, placing bowls where small hands could reach, said more than any words. The way Caleb handed her a ladle before sitting down, trusting her to serve the meal, said everything else. This wasn't about triumph. It wasn't about revenge. It was about presence. About showing up in the moment that once would have broken you and simply saying, "No more." And if you've ever stood in a moment like that, If you've ever faced down the voice that once told you you weren't enough, or the memory that tried to take back what you'd finally claimed, then you know how holy that stillness can feel. Not because it erases the past, but because it tells it clearly and finally, you don't own me anymore. This chapter didn't end with a bang. It ended with peace, with 5 bowls of stew on a worn table, with a fire that kept crackling, with laughter, quiet, unsure, but there. The kind that comes when the air feels safe again. When a woman knows her children can sleep through the night without listening for boots in the snow. If this part of the story stirred something in you, if you saw yourself in the woman at the door or the man who stood beside her, go ahead and like the video. Drop a comment below and share a time you stood your ground without raising your voice. Or maybe just tell us you're here. Sometimes that's enough. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, earned peace, and the kind of love that doesn't always need to be spoken, follow the channel. Because out here, in the places the world forgets to look, there are still cabins like this, still people like Martha and Caleb, and still firelight waiting to welcome you home. By the time spring came around, something had shifted. Not just the land, though the snow had finally melted and the creek was running strong again. Not just the trees, though. Fresh buds were blooming where brittle branches once hung. No, the real change was quieter, deeper. It was the way Caleb stood a little straighter when he stepped outside in the morning. The way Martha's voice carried a hum while she stirred stew or brushed Sadie's hair. It was the way the house didn't just shelter them anymore, it held them. The swing was Caleb's idea. He didn't say much about it, just started smoothing out a plank of cedar one afternoon. Toby brought the rope. Benji handed him nails like it was a ceremony. When it was done, that swing hung from the tall tree out front like it had always belonged there, and somehow it did. That crooked little plank of wood caught laughter now. Emma's squeals, Sadie's shy giggles, even Toby's reluctant smile. And Caleb, well, he didn't swing, but he watched. And watching was enough. Out back, Martha had claimed a space by the wall near the patch where nothing used to grow. She turned the soil with her hands, the kind of care that isn't rushed. She planted rosemary and sage, bits of onion and beans, herbs she said her mother once taught her to grow. And when she knelt down in that dirt, baby Emma nestled close by in a basket. She didn't look like someone scraping survival anymore. She looked like someone staying. They never called it love. Not allowed. Caleb never said the word. Martha didn't either. But it was there, in the bread she baked before the sun came up, in the shirt she mended without being asked, in the way Caleb warmed a blanket before handing it to her. In the steady rhythm of 2 people who didn't have to declare anything to make it real. Sometimes that's how love looks. Not in the grand confessions or the sudden kisses at sunset, but in the 1,000 quiet acts of choosing, of staying, of saying, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. You see, this place, this cabin, used to echo with ghosts, the kind that don't rattle chains or knock things off shelves, but the kind that sit heavy on your chest when you try to sleep. Caleb carried his own. Martha did too. They didn't ask each other for details, didn't trade scars like stories. But somehow, over time, their presence began to rewrite what those walls remembered. Now those same rooms carried different echoes. Laughter, the creak of the swing, a lullaby hummed soft near the fire. Evenings were no longer about keeping out the cold or the past. They were about being here, together. And make no mistake, life still had sharp edges. There were still nights when one of the children startled at a sudden sound, when Caleb's leg flared with pain, when Martha caught herself flinching at a shadow on the porch. Healing, after all, isn't a straight line. It's a winding trail with roots to trip over. But now, when someone stumbled, someone else reached out a hand. That's the difference. That's the story. By the time the first blooms opened near the fence post, the house wasn't just full, it was alive. Not with noise, but with something better. With rhythm, with purpose, with the quiet courage it takes to begin again. One evening, as the sun stretched gold across the field, Caleb stepped outside and found Martha on the swing. Emma asleep in her arms. Her feet were bare in the grass, skirt curled around her legs, hair pinned loosely. He didn't speak, just leaned against the porch post and watched. And Martha, she looked up, met his gaze, and smiled. Not wide, not showy, just the kind of smile that says, "You're here. I see you. Thank you. That was enough." And maybe that's the lesson here. Maybe love isn't loud. Maybe it doesn't arrive with a kiss in the rain or fireworks. Maybe it shows up in the middle of winter when you let someone stay. Maybe it grows in silence, in meals cooked together, in nails hammered straight. Maybe it becomes something bigger than either of you meant it to be. By the time summer rolls in, you won't find the same man who once limped through the snow alone. You won't find the same woman who curled up barefoot in his barn. What you'll find is a family, one that wasn't born by blood or name, but by choice. And maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you built something out of broken pieces, not knowing if it would hold, only to find it stronger than anything you had before. Maybe you're still building it. That's okay too. So if this story sat with you, if it reminded you of someone you love or hope to find, or maybe it just gave you a little warmth tonight, go ahead and like the video. Drop a comment below and tell us, what's one small act of love that changed everything for you? And if you want more stories like this, stories about healing, choice, quiet strength, and the kind of love that doesn't need a name, follow the channel. We'll keep telling them. Because out here, in cabins tucked against the edge of the world, in hands that hammer swings and grow herbs and light fires, love still lives, and no one is alone anymore.